Many thanks, Father Connor, for this very kind, first of all, invitation. I'm very happy. I wanted to say to be here, but of course not completely clear what here means. I'm currently in Westmeath and you're in Dublin. Very, very happy to be in this virtual space. And I'm again grateful to you and for the Dominican community at St. Saviour's for the invitation. And I'm delighted that so many people have taken out a chunk of their evening to listen to this talk. I hope it will be worthwhile, which is something that we can only judge in about 40 minutes time. Father Connor, if you don't mind, would you bring up on the screen this photo with which I would like to begin? Yes, so this is a photo which I took in October 2019 in a toilet at University College Dublin. What you can see there is that someone wrote on the wall right behind the toilet. If you look at the lower right-hand corner, someone wrote there, "My depression is worse than ever. I'm so lost." And then someone else, I presume, responded to this in the upper left-hand corner, well, not exactly the left-hand corner, and said, "Stay strong." And then, well, of course, we don't know in what sequences was written. Well, probably it's quite clear that the remark in the upper left-hand corner is a response to the one in the towards the bottom. But someone then at one point drew a heart, as though this to indicate a possible response to this difficulty. Thank you very much, Father Connor. I'm beginning with this graffiti because it brought home to me something about which we read a lot these days. Certainly every week there are articles in the Irish newspapers or other media about the epidemic of depression among young people in Ireland. This can stay quite abstract, though. You read a newspaper article or you look at something on the internet. This visit to the toilet at University College Dublin confronted me with the reality of this situation, because I was imagining this young student, obviously, going to the toilet, probably to weep there on his own, and to write desperately on the wall behind the toilet, "I am so depressed. My depression is getting worse." Of course, very, very, very sad. So that this person felt he had to retreat to the toilet and didn't feel that it was possible to open up to someone else. But then also there's hope in this graffiti, in that someone else entered the toilet instead of writing "Egypt." I mean, those of you who are male know what is often written on the walls of male toilets. But instead of adding banality or worse, the person wrote "Stay strong," and someone drew the heart, which gives the whole very, very, very sad image a more hopeful note. So after this start, my question, of course, is, what is it that causes depression among young people in Ireland? This is a well-known topic, and there's a lot of speculation about this. Sometimes, it's said that it's relative poverty. Ireland is a very wealthy country, but there are also a lot of young people who do not have access to wealth, or perhaps not even to what they need in order, let's say, to study. This is something that we've encountered at the university during COVID and during the lockdowns. There were certain students who were able to flourish during this period because they had all the latest computing equipment at home, and other students who didn't have a computer to log on it. So it could be poverty. A lot of discussion in the newspapers, especially recently in the last few weeks, a few months, let's say, draws attention to the fact that young people are depressed by the fact that they don't have a realistic prospect of acquiring their own home due to the inflation in property prices. So that could cause depression. Then there's again a lot of discussion regarding the effects of the internet, in particular social media, on the body image of young people, women, but certainly also men. There's a lot of bullying going on social media. That certainly would cause depression. And again, the whole this constant discussion in society about sexuality and about sexual orientation and so forth, could also give rise to anxieties among young people on that front. I mean, even anxieties about their own sexuality. All this, I don't want to dismiss any of that. I'm sure that these explanations all offer at least, a partial ways of explaining why young people would be depressed in Ireland. However, I would like to offer you this evening a thesis that I consider to be perhaps more fundamental. I would like to acknowledge that these may well be factors, but I would also like to say, or to argue, that the root cause of the epidemic of depression among young people in Ireland, and perhaps elsewhere, but let's also not overgeneralize and speak too broadly. It's always better to limit oneself a little bit in what one speaks about in order not to talk ultimately about things one doesn't understand. I would like to argue that the epidemic of depression among young people in Ireland may well have to do with the factors that I just mentioned and others, but is more fundamentally related to the very structure of the kind of society in which we now live. Has to do with the very structure of the society in which we now live. And what kind of society is that? Well, let me throw out a few adjectives in order to characterize it. We certainly live in a highly industrialized, perhaps now one should say technological society, with a heavily urban influence rather than rural. I mean, there are still people living in the countryside, but they don't seem to kind of dominate public debates. Our society is capitalist, it's liberal, it's democratic. And now you might say, well, what's unusual about that? It's the type of society which has existed since the beginning of the 20th century, certainly in Western Europe. Historically, however, this type of society is still a relative novelty. Beginning of the 20th century, that's, if you think in larger historical dimensions, is quite recent. And the novelty of this type of society and the unusual challenges that it poses was very well understood by intellectuals at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, who were in a situation similar to our own. That is to say, they saw the disappearance of an older world and the emergence of a newer one. And given the fact that they were intellectuals, they wanted to know what was going on and to think about it critically, which is, by the way, the same task that intellectuals, academics have in our own day, when very, very clearly there's another transition occurring. In particular, the intellectuals whom I have in mind, I could mention some philosophers. There are certainly signs of this kind of discussion, even in the writings of Martin Heidegger in the 1920s and 30s, someone with whom I'm quite familiar. But when I talk about intellectuals, I have in mind in particular the founders of sociology, of the modern discipline of sociology, which emerged precisely at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, and is connected with names like Max Weber, Georg Simmel, and Emil Durkheim. If one looks, by the way, at the dates of birth and death of these people, they all belong to the same generation. I'll just tell you when they passed away. Weber died in 1920, Simmel died in 1918, Emil Durkheim died in 1917. So these are people working in the same generation, producing these works that became the foundation of modern sociology, which is really, as a discipline, connected with or devoted to understanding the structures of modern society. Modern, as I just characterized it with these few adjectives that I threw out there. But we're talking about depression among young Irish people in the 21st century. For this question, one of the three whom I just mentioned is particularly relevant and important, namely Emil Durkheim, who in 1897 devoted one of the founding works of modern sociology to the question of suicide. Durkheim had noticed that in the emerging, increasingly urban, increasingly industrialized society in which he himself lived, rates of suicide were increasing. And he devoted this entire book to the question of why. In this talk that I am giving you this evening, I would like to proceed in 4 steps. First of all, an introduction, which I am now just in the process of concluding. Then I'm going to move on, secondly, to some historical remarks about different ways of thinking about the condition that we now call depression. And you can see already that I'm formulating very cautiously here. Thirdly, the longest part of my talk is going to be devoted to Emile Durkheim's theory on why people, he doesn't use the term depression, on why people commit suicide. And fourthly, I'm going to offer some critical remarks on Durkheim from a Christian perspective, which means I think that Durkheim's theory is very powerful, has a lot of truth in it. I don't think it's the ultimate truth, and I'm going to try to offer some correctives to that theory towards the end of my talk. Let me now get into the historical part. Human beings have always known this state, which we now call depression. You see that I'm careful in formulating what I just said. I didn't say human beings have always had the experience of depression, because that would be wrong. They haven't. Depression is a 20th century psychological term, which even Durkheim in 1897 doesn't use yet. Now one could say, well, that's just a difference of terminology. It probably goes much deeper than that. Human beings, and we can perhaps later talk about why that is, have this tendency to whatever, fall into this state, but it's conceptualized in different ways according to different cultures. The Greeks didn't speak of depression at all. They didn't know the term. They spoke of melancholy. And if you look at writers such as Aristotle, there are other ancient writers who write about this state, they recognize that this can be a painful state, but they also associate it with genius. So melancholy is not simply a state that needs medical cure, but it is a state also that favors the genius who, on the basis of this depression, has particular insights. The discourse about melancholy is particularly a classical one, but experienced a Renaissance. Well, during the Renaissance, perhaps not surprisingly, there is a very famous 17th century work by Robert Burton, The Anatomy of Melancholy. One of my friends in Dallas years ago gave me this beautiful leather-bound copy of Burton's Anatomy of Melancholy. If one thought that the Christian faith protects one against this state, that would be a mistake. The Christian discourse doesn't talk about melancholy, it doesn't talk about depression, it talks about acedia, which is the mental state that afflicts typically monks. It is connected with what nowadays we would call a certain spiritual dryness, the inability to pray properly, a sense that despite one's own faith, God doesn't really seem to make his presence felt in one's life, which leads to, well, and again, depression would be the wrong term, it leads to, a state of kind of spiritual hopelessness, about which, by the way, also Aquinas talks. And so that's the Christian way of talking about this. And again, one should not project either an ancient or contemporary terminology into the monastic literature, which is large, about acedia. Now, we don't really talk in our own day, we hardly talk about acedia anymore unless we are Christians and we're familiar with that discourse. That we still know the term melancholy, but mostly we talk about depression, because this is the medical term that has taken root in the psychological literature, what is called the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the American Psychological Association, which is always quoted in connection with topics having to do with psychology and psychiatry, offers definition of various types of depression and so forth. So we consider depression to be, of course, one could elaborate on this, but we don't connect it with genius. We also don't think that it has to do with faith. We tend to think it's a medical phenomenon. It could have to do with chemical imbalances in the brain. And the cure that we tend to prescribe for depression is either medicine or counseling, individual sessions of psychological or psychiatric therapy, which means that we're convinced that depression is a phenomenon that affects the individual. If someone comes forward, let's say at Maynooth University, a student, and says, well, I'm so depressed and I can't really focus on my studies, lecturers, we are supposed to refer this student to the counseling service, who will then, take care of this individual. Durkheim wants to argue that this approach to depression is certainly insufficient. Let's not say wrong. One has to be very nuanced in making judgments of this nature. not wrong, but insufficient, because Durkheim would say that depression, he uses factors leading to suicide. That's Durkheim's terminology. As I just said, he doesn't use the word depression. Factors leading to suicide have to do with the structure of modern society. So if somebody gets depressed, it's not so much that there's an imbalance in my brain or that I have problems in my life, but that there are problems in our society. That's what's one of the original and important and interesting points about Durkheim's approach. Now I move to the third part of my talk. I'm going to give you a very quick sketch of Durkheim's theory if you want to read about it, and it's worth reading. The book that I'm holding up here, Durkheim's Suicide, is a classic of modern sociology. It contains a section on what he calls anomic, which I'm going to explain in a minute, anomic suicide, which from which section the remarks that I'm going to share with you now have been taken. Durkheim's analysis begins with the following statement. In living beings, it is crucial that there should be a proportion between needs and means. There has to be a proportion between needs and means. Example, an animal, and of course we are also as human beings animals to the extent that we have bodies, an animal needs an amount of nutrition that is proportionate to the energy that this animal burns in its body, okay? In the animal realm too, I mean, there can be problems. There can be malnutrition, for example. Or if you give a dog too much food, the dog will overeat. There's no proportion between the dog's needs and the actual food given, and the dog will fall sick or throw up or something like this. In the case of the human being, Durkheim says, the situation is rendered more complex in that we are endowed with reason, which also means imagination. And this imagination allows us to always imagine a better condition. One could say, now I'm using a term that Durkheim doesn't use, perhaps already pointing to my critique later on. Human beings, in virtue of reason, possess transcendence. I'm able to transcend the moment in which I live. So if you give a dog a bowl of food, the dog, unless the food is totally disgusting, bits of lung or something, the dog will wolf down the food and be quite happy. If you pat the dog on the head as a sign of affection, the dog will be very happy. The dog will not, like a human being, then ask questions like, does he really love me? Or does he love the other doggy more? These are not questions that occur to the dog because the dog is not rational, doesn't possess transcendence. But we as human beings are rational. So if I have a plate of food in front of me, I'm thinking, why am I not in the saddle room in Dublin? But I'm just at home, eating this soup that I bought in Dunn's. Look, I mean, you see the direction in which it's going. Let me not make too much fun of this kind of situation. It could be in a relationship, even an intimate relationship, and it can turn tragic when I ask myself, well, isn't there someone better out there for me? Which, of course, most likely will precipitate a crisis in my relationship with this other person. So one can see the transcendence with which human reason is endowed. On the one hand, constitutes the greatness of the human being, transcendence, an opening up of horizons. On the other hand, according to Durkheim very, very strongly emphasizes the problems that are connected with this. Because we have this tendency always to try to imagine a better condition, we become, and I just quote a few words that he uses, insatiable. We develop an inextinguishable thirst. We pursue infinite, ever-receding goals. So that's from Durkheim. This in turn, of course, I mean, if you look at the very negative terminology that he uses, infinite ever-receding goals, for example, this, of course, causes painful unrest, restlessness, and even the risk of suicide. Durkheim, in the pages which I'm summarizing for you now, writes that our thread of life on these conditions, which I just described for you, is pretty thin, breakable at any point. Durkheim believes that the role of society consists in regulating and moderating these appetites, the human appetites, which, due to the role of reason and the imagination, have a tendency of getting out of control, of growing infinite, of becoming unmanageable. Durkheim believes that society regulates the appetites through three mechanisms. The first is a very basic economic mechanism having to do with salaries. Salaries are given, are granted, paid in accordance with occupational groups. So a workman typically will, of course, make less than the director of the company for which or in which the workman labors. So the workman receives a lower salary than the director of the company. The very fact that the workman has a limited amount of money means that there are limits, is an upper limit to the workman's aspirations. The workman can hope to save up money to buy a small house, can hope to save money for, perhaps holidays, or save up money for a new dress for his wife, etc., etc. But the workman would not normally dream of living in the castle in which the director of the company lives, because the director of the company makes so much more money, and so this allows the director to buy a castle somewhere in the Irish countryside. But at the same time, the workman would have an expectation regarding lower limits. So the workman would expect to have a salary enough to sustain himself and his family, to pay for occasional visits to the cinema, of course, get enough food, etc., to receive a salary that allows him to lead a dignified human life. In the kind of society which Durkheim describes as more traditional, it would have been accepted that the horizon of expectation of the workman is different from the horizon of expectation of the director of the company. The director of the company can dream of another castle in the French countryside. And given the director's salary, that would be normal. The workman can't have such dreams. They're cut off. The workman wouldn't even come up with such dreams. The workman would know that that was simply beyond any reasonable expectation. Durkheim views this mechanism as positive because it allows satisfaction to be reached within these limits. A second mechanism, which according to Durkheim tempers the appetites, has to do with government, or what he calls temporal power. That's a kind of old-fashioned term that he uses there, but he does use it. Durkheim says that the temporal power assigns a restrained, limited role to economic life, which remains subordinate to the common good. So take a society that functions according to Durkheim in a healthy way, in a normal way. In that type of society, government would put economics in its place. Economics would not become the ultimate factor, the ultimate power governing all of society, but would be subordinated to values like community, nation. The government would, let's say, try to be a good government for the Irish nation, or would try to promote the interests of the German nation, of the French nation. This means that simply material appetites remain within the community subordinate to other goals, which are not merely economic, that are promoted by, well, as Durkheim says, the temporal power. And finally, Durkheim talks about the role of religion. He believes that religion has two functions in this large scheme of his. It justifies the existing social order as providential, on the one hand, and on the other hand, opens up the possibility of more complete justice in the hereafter. So perhaps the workman looks at the director and says, well, that's really unfair that I live in a small row house in Dublin and the director has a castle in the countryside, another castle in France. But then the workman would say, yes, but that doesn't have anything to do with justice in the hereafter, with our respective fates in the hereafter. Whoever has, prayed or read the Psalms know what they say about the wealthy man, and that, the wealthy man is not someone who should be excessively admired, because one really doesn't know what God's plans are for the wealthy man, and perhaps, depending on his or her conduct, the plans aren't good. So, all these three mechanisms, according to Durkheim, have been weakened in our modern type of society. In the type of society whose birth and development Durkheim and the other sociologists witnessed at the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century. First of all, there has been an abrupt growth of wealth, Durkheim says. Now think in Ireland of the Celtic Tiger. That certainly was an abrupt growth of wealth, which disrupts the first aspect, the first mechanism, which limits people's aspirations in accordance with the financial resources which are at their disposal. Suddenly, the financial resources at the disposal of a population explode, which means that aspirations which previously would simply have been unrealistic become possibilities, like constant holidays in Spain. Or other things which just 50 years ago would have been unimaginable. And so this leads to a first breakdown in one of the factors that used to temper the appetites. Secondly, what about government or temporal power? Governments increasingly, and note that Durkheim writes this at the beginning or at the dawn of the 20th century, governments have lost the authority to determine what is just. Why? Because, for two reasons. Well, first of all, because there has been a breakdown of the sense of the common good, to which various classes, groups of population in society would have subordinated their aspirations. The government would have defined a common good for which everyone in that society would have been willing to make sacrifices, to which everyone in that society would have been willing to subordinate him or her aspirations. That's no longer the case. The sense of the common good has been weakened. Furthermore, governments, Durkheim writes in 1897, no longer rein in economic interests, but simply facilitate them. That's to say, governments no longer see themselves as standing above economic factors. So, for example, the government pursues the national interest. One part of the national interest is a flourishing economy, along with 10 other aspects of the national interest. But rather, writes Durkheim, and I emphasize again in 1897, governments become mere mechanisms enacting goals that are economic ones, which again leads to a kind of, well, it leads to economic interests getting out of control because there are no longer any political factors limiting them. And finally, Simmel talks about the breakdown of the sense that there are different levels of talent and accomplishment. So perhaps the workman, by the way, let me now say, obviously the workman can be just as intelligent or more intelligent than the director of the company. But in a society that functions according to some degree of justice, the workman would have understood that he does, contributes manual labor to the company, and the director of the company directs the worldwide operations of that company. And there would have been a sense that perhaps then the director is justly paid a higher salary. That sense has disappeared in contemporary society, so that the workman would want just the same life as the director of the company. And thirdly, Simmel writes, again, at the dawn of the 20th century, that religion is losing its force, which was, if we remember, the third factor limiting, tempering the human appetites. What is the result of this situation? Well, I'll give you two quotations. One, the appetites are freed from any limiting authority. And another sentence, following the one I quoted, just following it immediately, is the appetites are sanctified, Durkheim writes, in an apotheosis of well-being which places them above all human law. Because that is such a wonderful quotation, I'm going to read it to you again. The appetites are sanctified. Note the religious language. The appetites themselves acquire a pseudo-religious quality. The appetites are sanctified in an apotheosis, that's a religious term, a kind of divinization of well-being, which places them above all human law. So simply satisfying human appetites becomes the all-determining law of human society. This deregulation of the appetites is what Durkheim famously calls in French anomie, which then in English is simply transliterated as anomy. Anomy. It's not, of course, a term in current contemporary English. It is a term in sociology. It's easy to explain. Nomos means law, and the alpha privativum is an element that which negates what it precedes. So anomie or anomy is a certain lawlessness. It's an absence of law. So modern society is characterized by a deregulation of the appetites, which Durkheim calls anomy. This has the inevitable consequence of a constant restlessness, weariness, disillusionment, and ultimately the rise in rates of suicide. Because the situation that we have is that we are constantly pursuing goals which we are in principle unable to satisfy because they keep receding and our appetites are infinite. I aspire to a better type of life, but once I've reached that better type of life, if I reach it, if I win the lotto, then I will dream of even another castle, or holidays that are even more luxurious, or another cruise. And of course, since I never seem to be able to reach a horizon, it's clear that this leads to restlessness. What are the words that he uses? I'll read them to you again. Weariness, disillusionment, and then ultimately the sense that I'm unable to answer the question what it's all about. My horizon, my goal seems to be receding forever. And well, that's a very, very sad thought. And given various other factors, which Durkheim describes in great detail in his book, that may well lead to rises in rates of suicide. I will wrap up my summary of Durkheim's position by reading you a slightly longer, only a few lines quote from the section on anomic suicide in his book. Society comes to accept, he writes, this condition of anomy as normal. So the abnormal comes to be considered normal, this condition of anomy. It is everlastingly repeated that it is man's nature to be eternally dissatisfied, constantly to advance without relief toward an indefinite goal. The doctrine of the most ruthless and swift progress has become an article of faith. Note again the religious language which suddenly flows in here. Although Durkheim was a completely secular writer, he had himself no religious commitments. But it's interesting that he says the doctrine of the most ruthless and swift progress has become an article of faith. So it seems that some kind of pseudo-religion has taken root in our society, but which is no longer a religion that leads to God. It's a religion that leads to progress, to this restless pursuit of satisfying appetites that are by definition insatiable. So far, Durkheim's description of the causes of the rise of suicide in our modern societies. I would like to wrap up my talk with an attempt to offer a few points of Christian criticism of Durkheim. I would not have summarized Durkheim or interpreted Durkheim for you in such great detail if I didn't think that there was a lot of truth in his analysis. So I think there's a lot of truth in his analysis. It is also what I find interesting always when I have the privilege of reading classics with my students or just on my own. It is interesting how these classical authors from Aristotle right through writers of the 20th century still hold so much truth. So in order to understand the condition of Irish society in 2022, certainly we can read something that was written in 2022, but we can also read a book that was written in 1897. And it already gives us a lot of insight into what's going on in the contemporary world. So I think there's a lot of truth in Durkheim. I don't think that Durkheim is the truth. I think there are very important elements missing in what he's saying, which I'm going to try to sketch briefly for you, perhaps in the last few minutes of my talk. I think that the problem with Durkheim, the fundamental problem from which other problems then flow, is that he treats the desire for the infinite, which he observes in human beings and correctly observes, he treats that desire in itself and as such as morbid. In fact, that's one of his definitions of anomy, namely a failure on the part of society to close the horizon of human expectation. So if society doesn't close the horizon of human expectation, this causes anomy, which causes all kinds of social dysfunctions, which causes suicide. Of course, one would say, and from a Christian perspective, but also perhaps simply from a perspective of looking at the human condition, whether the desire for transcendence that characterizes human reason is not something which should make us think about, the question. Aristotle would say whether nature does anything in vain. How come that we have this desire for the infinite, for this desire for the transcend? Is it simply a malady? Is it simply an illness? Or does it tell us something about a destiny of the human being that's not simply a satisfaction of appetites, but perhaps lies a little bit beyond that? Of course, that does come from a religious perspective, but it's also interesting how even what Durkheim says opens a religious horizon for someone who has a little bit more of a religious sensibility. Durkheim recognizes the role of religion in creating healthy social conditions, but he does look at religion simply from a kind of mechanistic point of view. Religion is an important ingredient in society because it tempers the appetites. Durkheim doesn't have a positive view of religion as, what should I say, a factor which contains truth in its own right. So his understanding of religion is very reductionist. And I would suggest to complete or correct Durkheim's analysis by looking at religion not simply as this factor which tempers the appetites, but which educates the desire for the infinite, which directs the hunger for the transcendent which characterizes the human being. So religion properly understood certainly, what should I say, tempers the appetites, but this whole, what should I say, thirst for transcendence which is in the human being is, it's not the function of religion to stifle that, but to, as I just said, educate it, cultivate it, and help it find a meaningful destiny for itself. So one could say that from a Christian perspective then, according to what I just tried to explain, much of Durkheim's analysis remains valid, except that the function of religion is not to stifle the desire for the infinite, but to cultivate and educate it. One could say help it reach its transcendent goal. If we adopt this perspective which is really a Thomistic one, Thomas Aquinas was one of the great methodological strengths of Thomas Aquinas was that he always acknowledged the truth and the insights, even in the ideas of his adversaries, of his philosophical opponents, but always tried to complete them in a more comprehensive Christian account of things. And that's what I'm trying to do a little bit here with Durkheim. So the more complete perspective does change our diagnosis of the cultural situation somewhat. On the more complete account, which I'm trying to argue for here, the desire for the infinite is not simply an illness, but it is a characteristic of human reason as such. The problem then in contemporary society is not the desire for the infinite. It is rather the fact that the desire for the infinite has come to be immanentized. And I'm using here a term which is not my own, but comes from a German-American philosopher by the name of Erich Voegelin, or originally was from Austria, so Erich Voegelin, or since he then lived in the United States, Erich Voegelin, who very famously spoke of the immanentization of the eschaton as the fundamental problem of contemporary society. And it seems to me that this insight which comes from Voegelin can be combined with Durkheim in order to yield a more complete analysis of what's going on in our contemporary society. So the problem is not, as Durkheim would have it, that we have infinite desires, that we have infinite aspirations. The problem is that we are trying to satisfy these infinite aspirations in this world, in the society that surrounds us. That leads to a complete distortion of life in society. I expect then to be able to reach all the goals of my life in this life. And it's understandable that that leads to dissatisfaction. It may not be possible, but I'm trying to do it in this life. Likewise, I can no longer live with a recognition of the fact that there is no complete justice in this life, but I have to immanentize absolute justice. So now, therefore, I can never content myself with the idea that, for example, somebody committing a crime doesn't receive punishment. This person must receive punishment because there's no beyond, because everything has to happen in this world. This theme of the immanentization of the eschaton is a big theme in Catholic theology and political thought in the 20th century. Some of the greatest Catholic theologians of the 20th century have thought very much along the same lines as Voegelin, although independently of Voegelin. I mention only two names. One of them is Henri de Lubac. Another is Joseph Ratzinger. Both probably not unknown to quite a few people in the audience. Ratzinger, or Pope Benedict, devoted his second doctorate, which in German is called Habilitation, to this precise problem. How come that in contemporary society, we have this idea according to which complete satisfaction, absolute justice has to be brought about in this life, which is also associated with Marxism. But you see, it's not just Marxism, it's also our type, it's also capitalism as well, functions on precisely the same principle. All our desires have to be satisfied in this life, and they have to be satisfied economically. That's what drives our consumption. That's what's keeping the whole thing going. And de Lubac and Ratzinger and other theologians agreed, but I can't elaborate on this now because it would, that the root of this entire problem lies in the 12th century, when a Benedictine by the name of Joachim of Fiore, a Cistercian by the name of Joachim of Fiore, devised a very brilliant and very eccentric theology of history, which then, in a complicated story, got out of control, and according to these theologians, created modern society. On that account, to which I think is the correct account, what we're witnessing in the contemporary society around us is not simply a break with the Christian tradition, but is in its essence a Christian heresy. On this note, I thank you for your interest in my talk. I hope you found a little bit of interest in it. I leave it up to Father Connor to decide whether there's still time left for some discussion.